So what I'm going to do very quickly is just give you a couple of examples, a couple of models to think about sort of the digital side of this data revolution. As statistician George Box said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And there's some metaphors in here that may be useful. I mean, conceptually, right, we've seen data revolutions before, right? The field of medicine has had its own data revolutions. Medical imaging was a data revolution. Right? Genetics is a data revolution. It completely transformed medical practice. And that's really the point. It's not the data that's revolutionary. It's the ability to operationalize decision-making based on new kinds of data that change your practices, your organizational practices, the processes that you follow, the kinds of interventions and the kinds of measures that you're able to implement. So kind of going into this, what's different here? I mean, real-time analysis of big data allows you to observe human behavior continuously. And there's sort of three facets to this that we need to get your head around. How many of you ever played a driving video game? Raise your hands. I know you played a driving video. Some of you. So you know what happens if there's like a half-second delay? Right, I mean, you crash instantly. Why? Because navigating around obstacles that weren't there a second ago requires real-time awareness of what's happening. You know, the traditional model of development was very linear. This idea that you shoot an arrow at the target, and unless the wind blows, the target's not likely to move. This is where the whole log frame mentality comes from, right? If you make a good plan based on the best data that you have, and you implement that plan faithfully, you will achieve your outcomes. So this new reality, this complex, interconnected world that we're living in, we think that driving in traffic is a better metaphor in some ways for how you implement development programs in the field these days. The idea that you're having to navigate around obstacles that weren't there before, and in some cases, you find halfway through implementation that the goal has changed. And you have to figure out how to build on the investments you've made when the primary problem you're working on is now shifted. Secondly, you know, big data is a very different animal than sort of traditional survey data. It's collected, it's generated continuously, and it can be analyzed continuously. Video, in at least how we perceive video, is very different qualitatively, and it allows you to do different kinds of things. And I think this metaphor works in some ways to really understand that, you know, we see this as not replacing survey-based data collection, but more complementary, in the same way that video hasn't replaced photography. A lot of big data can't tell you causality, but it can tell you when something concerning is starting to happen. And the idea is really when you see something odd show up on your grainy black and white video, you can go in and take a high-resolution snapshot of a community and find out what's actually going on. It's a new complementary type of information. And finally, with all the risks of being seen as a positivist, I mean, this is empirical data. And you know, the fact that people all over the world are now carrying mobile phones in their pockets that generate all of this, you know, complex sensor data is transforming the social sciences utterly, and with them development. You know, you can ask people how many times they went to market last month, but you could also see that, right? The idea that we can now bring in observational data on a massive scale in near real time is really transformative. The kinds of data that are useful for understanding behavior change, what people say, and you can see some examples of this here, and it's people and organizations, and what people do. The former category up there is, a lot of this is sort of open data. It's not officially open data. Most people don't have the ability to handle 500 million Twitter messages coming out every day, so that doesn't really count as open and accessible for all. But this is data that's out there. The second category, the real powerful behavioral data, this is held by private sector very closely to competitive advantage. And yet this data contains signals that we believe have incredible potential to inform decision-making for public policy, for humanitarian action, and so forth. But as the report lays out, there are a lot of challenges around access to this data, how to incentivize sharing, how to protect privacy in the process, and how institutions are going to have to change to incorporate these new kinds of information into how they operate. So in general, think of this as all along the timeline. Ways to understand, to do prediction, to see a crisis coming earlier that might cause a setback in development, ways to understand right now what's happening to a population rather than using 3-year-old statistical data as you plan and implement your programs. And this latter category is really interesting. It's certainly Global Pulse, we found this was caught us by surprise, but more than half of the projects we're working on now are in the realm of evaluation. This idea that real-time feedback on the effectiveness of your programs and policies can allow you to continuously adapt your strategy until you're getting the results that you need to. That concept of adaptive dynamic programming is something that is made possible by getting real-time information. So a couple of examples. This is a project that we were working on in Indonesia where we simply built a model that correlated people complaining online about how much they were paying for food with official Ministry of Trade statistics on food prices from 30 cities across the country. As you can see, the predictive model is pretty good. We call this complainonomics or wingilytics because basically the model works until food prices drop very quickly, and then people stop complaining and the signal disappears. So no one's going to start a hedge fund from this. But the point is, for food security monitoring, we think this type of approach is interesting. All of these models have limits, but so long as prices are high or are rising, you get lots of signal, and it turns out to be representative. We've been working with the Ministry of Health, UNICEF, and WHO in Indonesia. Turns out a lot of parents are online talking about why they don't intend to vaccinate their children. Religious authorities saying why you shouldn't vaccinate your children. People responding to stories and rumors that cause these kinds of behavior changes. This is an example of the kind of information that can tell you when there's an emerging risk to a program, right? And let you get out very quickly. This is not means that you're going to change a policy because of this information, but it can mean that you can reach out to local health authorities and find out, you know, what's going on, who said what on the radio, and how can we get behavior back on track. Discrimination. This was a project we worked on during the World Cup with UNAIDS, mapping levels of discrimination in all of the 30 sites where there were games underway. They had a big campaign around getting people to get tested and staying safe during the game. So again, you can create maps of stigma that are likely to cause HIV-positive people not to seek treatment. That kind of information, again, complements what you'd be tracking through statistics. Now this is an interesting case study. This is a project we're about to publish on from a country in sub-Saharan Africa. What you see on the left is a heat map that shows a city in the middle of the map. And this is generated by looking at the 30-day moving average of how much money people spent on their mobile phones. So we got access to millions and millions of records of Airtime scratch card transactions, right? Some people top off 20 cents at a time, some top off $5, $10 at a time. And it turns out that when you look at how much money people spend on their mobile phones over the course of a year, there's a couple of harvests every year and so forth, they spend on average about 7% of what they spend on food. We got WFP survey data from 7,000 households across the country, got a 0.89 R-squared value. When people have more money, they spend more on food and they spend more on airtime, and it tracks proportionally over the course of the year across every socioeconomic level. So basically, if you can get real-time information on airtime purchases and multiply it by 15, you can compute an estimate of how much money people are spending on food at that time. And that's very exciting because the idea here now is that we're moving forward to build a piece of software, an open source tool that can run behind every mobile phone operator's network in sub-Saharan Africa and generate real-time maps, trend lines, and alerts on this kind of information without requiring the sensitive data be shared outside the network. Here we can see, you know, when people use their mobile phones, they move. They move about the city through one tower and through another. And it turns out that you can get anonymized data from a mobile phone network and you can see movement patterns of a population in real time. All the maps that we use for development work, mobile phone operators can see the population moving in real time. How are people displaced after a disaster? Why is this population in this slum going all the way over here for maternal care when there are 2 clinics nearby? Right? We've never been able to see this before. But you can see millions of people moving around. And in this case, we were able to look at the floods in Mexico and Tabasco State in 2009 and show a normal night versus the night that the floods hit. WFP was interested in understanding whether we could detect the emergence of spontaneous camps of displaced people so that they could get the trucks on the road faster. This is something we showed at our launch event. This is postal flow data. We've just gotten access to 4 years of the records of every package, letter, and MoneyGram money transfer between 150 countries. Data set is generated in real time through the Universal Postal Union. So we're now starting to explore how this information could be used to detect the effects of economic shocks, for example, possibly estimate GDP. There's some initial correlations with e-commerce data that suggest there are not a lot of love letters out there anymore. It seems to be a lot of e-commerce is what's flowing these days. And finally, this isn't something we're very excited about in terms of getting at that digital divide, right? You know, we're working in our lab in Uganda, and we see not a lot of people are on social media outside of Kampala, but there are 122 FM radio stations. And a lot of people in sub-Saharan Africa have Android phones that have FM radio chips, just because they're using the phone as a radio. And the idea is if we can build an app that can stream these public open conversations into a database, we can use dictation software and build a real-time map aggregated showing where people are talking about food prices, crop failure, disease symptoms, domestic violence, jobs, whatever it be. So we think that's going to be a useful new approach. Where can this go? Oh, right now we've seen where a public-private data commons using real-time data can go, and that's meteorology. Right? I can go to 100 different websites, type in my postal code, and I can get real-time sensor information on temperature and wind speed. That data fed into predictive models so I can see what's happening next week and get alerts if concerning patterns like swirling clouds start to appear. We want to create out of big data through public-private partnerships, innovative new tools and methodologies, and institutions in a position to use this information, the socioeconomic equivalent of meteorological stations. This should be a global public good, a commons available to the world so that we can measure health or jobs or food security in real time anywhere on Earth.